This is the first period in American history that offers a clear distinction between domestic and foreign policy. Just as George Washington forewarned, relations with other nations would entangle America into a series of international conflicts. Meanwhile, at home, Americans grappled with unbearable rates of industrial poverty, rising nativism, and groups who were becoming increasingly assertive regarding their place within America's social fabric, one which proclaimed that all were created equal. Obviously, the domestic changes, including the Great Depression, dramatically alter our foreign calculations. But for ease and understanding, I have chosen to discuss this period thematically rather than chronologically. Thus, this episode on foreign policy during the first half of the 20th century will reference domestic events, without providing a full explanation, leaving that task for the next episode. You're listening to APush Through History, a resource designed to help students completing the course of AP US History. This episode covers the first subject of Period 7, 1890 to 1945, America on the World Stage. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had transformed. The frontier, once seen as the edge of American civilization, had disappeared from maps. And in 1893, historian Frederick Jackson Turner captured the anxiety and possibility of that moment in his work, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, where he argued that the existence of the frontier had defined the American character, fostering independence, innovation, and democratic values. But now, he warned, that era was over. If America was to maintain its vitality, it would need a new frontier. For many Americans, that frontier would be found abroad. The stage was set for a period of imperial expansion, one in which the U.S. would become an assertive player on the world stage, acquiring territories, fighting wars overseas, and reshaping its identity and role in global politics. Rather than sea to shining sea, believers in American exceptionalism began to believe that manifest destiny meant that America would have influence throughout the globe. American imperialism didn't spring out of nowhere. It was shaped by a blend of economic ambitions, ideological beliefs, and geopolitical strategies. The U.S. economy, now fully industrialized, was booming. But with booming production came a problem: overproduction. It was only in 1874 that the U.S. reversed its unfavorable balance of trade due to increasing agricultural and manufacturing exports. Businesses needed new markets to sell their goods and new sources of raw materials. Asia, and especially China, offered both. Strategically, the U.S. needed to protect its commercial interests across the globe. Enter Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, made the case that global dominance required a powerful navy and access to overseas ports and coaling stations. His ideas resonated deeply with not just U.S. policymakers, but the Emperor of Japan, setting the two nations on a collision course. These economic and military concerns were bolstered by ideology, social Darwinism, and a renewed sense of manifest destiny, now global in scope. The belief that the U.S. had a duty to civilize other nations, often couched in racist, paternalistic terms, fueled a moral justification for imperialism, allowing the US to believe that they remained the good guys, despite their actions. The US began its overseas expansion with Alaska, purchased from Russia in 1867. Critics called it Seward's folly, but Alaska proved rich in resources, particularly oil. Then came Hawaii, where American sugar planters wielded immense influence. When the Queen tried to reassert native rule in the 1890s, American businessmen with support from U.S. Marines engineered a coup in order to avoid the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890. President Grover Cleveland initially refused to support the annexation of Hawaii, leaving it in a strange limbo for 5 years. But the islands were annexed in 1898 by his successor, William McKinley, giving the U.S. a key naval base at Pearl Harbor. The United States had long had its eye on the prosperous island of Cuba. Spain, the overlords of the island nation, had been bogged down by an insurgent war of Cubans seeking independence. Despite pleas, America attempted to remain neutral. That all changed with the explosion of the USS Maine, an American warship that had been sent to Havana Harbor to investigate claims of human rights abuses. Just after meeting with their Spanish counterparts, the Maine exploded. Although the true cause was a flaw in the ship's design, yellow journalists like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer sensationalized the incident, inflaming public opinion with cries of "Remember the Maine." Only after the Teller Amendment was passed, however, did America officially declare war on Spain. That amendment made it clear that the purpose of the war was not to annex Cuba, but to instead liberate it. The war itself was brief, just 4 months, but it had lasting consequences. The U.S. quickly defeated Spanish forces in both the Philippines and Cuba. One of the war's most iconic moments came at the Battle of San Juan Hill, where Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders earned fame, largely because TR brought with him his own crew of friendly journalists. But often overlooked were the Buffalo Soldiers, African-American troops from the 9th and 10th Cavalry, who played a critical role in the victory. These soldiers faced discrimination and segregation from white units, yet were instrumental in some of the most important battles of the war, arriving atop San Juan Hill first in order to clear it out so that Roosevelt could get the perfect photo op. Despite their bravery, African-American soldiers returned home to a nation still deeply entrenched in Jim Crow laws and racial violence. Their experience highlighted the hypocrisy of a country claiming to spread freedom abroad while denying it at home. The war concluded with the Treaty of Paris in 1898, which granted the U.S. control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and unofficial control over Cuba via the Platt Amendment. The U.S., having purchased the Philippines for $20 million, immediately set about setting up a colonial government on the island nation, something that resulted in a multi-years war for control. With new Pacific holdings, the U.S. next turned to China, a fragmented empire dominated by European powers. Attempting to avoid what would later become known as the Century of Humiliations, China sought to close off its borders from the wider world, which had been dumping their products upon their shores. America, a nation of manufacturers at this time, was incredibly afraid of what would happen to their economy if America were to be shut out of the lucrative Chinese market. Secretary of State John Hay issued the Open Door Notes, urging equal trade access for all foreign powers. Note that this was a unilateral decision, not done in conjunction via diplomacy with the sitting Chinese emperor, who ignored the series of open door letters, something that the US interpreted as consent. Then came the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, an anti-foreigner uprising in China which saw a group of monks violently destroy anything that came from the West, including technology, power lines, and churches. The US joined a multinational force to put it down, marking a turning point. America was now willing to project military power to protect economic interests. President Theodore Roosevelt took imperialism a step further with his big stick policies. When Colombia refused to grant rights for a canal, the US backed a revolution in Panama. The new Panamanian government signed the Hay-Buena-Varilla Treaty, giving the US control of the Panama Canal Zone. The process was quite shady, as the US gave strategic support to a rebel group, parked its warships in the harbor, and offered $10 million for the purchase of the land. The canal, completed in 1914, revolutionized global trade and US military mobility. It also symbolized America's growing imperial might. But most importantly, the canal allowed the US Navy to respond to threats in the Atlantic and Pacific. Roosevelt also issued the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, declaring that the US had the right to intervene in Latin America to maintain order. It marked a shift from passive protection of the Western Hemisphere to active management, often at the expense of Latin American sovereignty. When World War I erupted in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat who had managed to pull the African American vote from the Republican Party, pledged neutrality. But that position, like his support among African Americans, grew harder to maintain, particularly after Wilson watched the KKK propaganda film A Birth of the Nation in the White House. It wasn't inevitable that America would enter the war, as powerful interest groups such as the Woman's Peace Party, American Union Against Militarism, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace all pushed against the march to war. Their anti-war movement regularly pointed out that war kills young people, fosters repression, and lets business moguls make big profits at the expense of the little guys. The movement was so popular that Wilson himself claimed to be anti-war, running and winning the 1916 presidential election on a promise to keep out of the conflict. But by 1917, several factors forced the US into the war. First was unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany, which sank ships like the Lusitania and Sussex, both of which had Americans aboard. Secondly was the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany encouraged Mexico to attack the US in an attempt to regain territory lost in the US-Mexico War. Third was a desire to shape the post-war world, with Wilson vowing to make the world safe for democracy. Despite not joining the war for the first 3 years, America didn't miss much, as the fronts remained unchanged from the beginning of the war, when soldiers formed up trenches. With no man's land separating them, the superior defensive technology of machine guns, poison gas, and mortars prevented either side from gaining an inch. Just before America entered the war, Russia withdrew after Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Their withdrawal allowed Germany to concentrate its forces on the Western Front. Without America entering on the side of England and France, the outcome may have been different. The rise of communism in Russia deeply alarmed American leaders and helped sow the seeds of the first Red Scare, as fears of radicalism and anarchism spread back at home, resulting in Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer claiming that communists were infiltrating every aspect of American life, including our churches and our homes. These years saw a curtailing of civil liberties, the rise of nativism, and a crackdown on dissent, a paradoxical outcome of a war supposedly fought for democracy. Italians Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested and sentenced to death based upon shady evidence supported by the fact that they were foreign anarchists. Wilson passed the Espionage Act of 1917, which forbade false statements against the draft or the military and banned anti-war mailings. He followed it up with the Sedition Act of 1918, which made it illegal to obstruct the sale of war bonds and to use nasty language against the government, constitution, flag, or uniform. Rather than a symbolic gesture, the Espionage and Sedition Acts were used to crack down on Union members and socialists, including Eugene Debs, a noted Union activist and eventual presidential candidate for the American Socialist Party. Debs was arrested for speaking out about the freedom to criticize the government. It could have been worse for Debs, as patriotic Americans used the War and Sedition Act to form their own vigilante organizations, which attacked citizens who weren't outwardly patriotic enough. The Sedition Slammers and the American Defense Society were two such groups. There was enough controversy that the Supreme Court was called into action, upholding the president's acts through the Schenck v. U.S. decision in 1919. That case established a clear and present danger criteria for restricting free speech, providing the example that it is wrong to maliciously yell "fire" in a crowded theater. In order to prepare for the war, the U.S. underwent the largest naval expansion in U.S. history via the Navy Act of 1916. Congress also passed the Selective Service Act, a draft of all 21 to 30-year-old men. Critics felt the measure would lead to excessive militarism, but supporters countered that it would lead to good, healthy patriotism. Most draftees were white, poorly educated Americans in their early 20s. Over 350,000 African Americans served in World War I, most in segregated units led by white officers, most of which were relegated to support roles, but some did see combat, most famously the Harlem Hellfighters of the 369th Infantry Regiment. Their participation in the conflict only happened after they were placed beneath the command of America's French allies. The Hellfighters spent more time in combat than any other American unit and were honored by the French with their highest award for bravery, shattering American notions that African Americans were unfit for fighting. These brave soldiers, however, returned home to a country where they were still second-class citizens. Racial tensions flared in the post-war period, culminating in the Red Summer of 1919 when race riots erupted across U.S. cities. At the same time, African Americans began moving north in large numbers. The Great Migration began during World War I, as Black Americans left the Jim Crow South for industrial jobs in northern cities. They sought better opportunities, but often found de facto segregation, crowded housing, and hostile white laborers. Still, the migration marked a demographic shift that would reshape American cities and lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement. The key battle for the Allies was the Second Battle of the Marne, where Americans turned the tide against the Germans in July 1918. As the war wound down, Wilson presented his 14 points, envisioning a post-war world based on open diplomacy, self-determination, free trade, and the establishment of a League of Nations. But at the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson faced stiff resistance from both European powers and the U.S. Senate. It didn't help that Wilson had ignored requests from Republican senators to be a part of the mission. European leaders wanted to punish Germany, and back home, senators like Henry Cabot Lodge worried that the League would entangle the U.S. in future conflicts. Ultimately, the Senate never ratified the treaty and never joined the League of Nations, a bitter failure for Wilson and a sign of renewed isolationism that would come in the interwar years. World War I brought about major changes to the American home front, which saw increased business-government cooperation through the introduction of the War Industries Board in 1917. This group worked closely with corporations in order to ensure that government contracts were fulfilled in a timely and efficient manner. It ultimately resulted, however, in the creation of the military-industrial complex, benefiting big business by temporarily suspending antitrust laws. The government also elevated the profile of Republican Herbert Hoover, who led the Food Administration Agency, which pushed voluntary rationing programs such as Victory Gardens. To pay for the war, the government increased taxes via the Revenue Acts of 1916 and 1917 and pushed the sale of Liberty bonds. During this period, unemployment basically vanished and wages increased. People rushed into the cities and to manufacturing jobs. As a result of the war, workers were strongly discouraged to strike, and the National War Labor Board was established in 1918 to coordinate actions between management and unions. Between 1890 and 1945, the U.S. underwent a dramatic transformation. It went from an isolationist nation recovering from the Civil War to a global imperial power with territories, alliances, and influence stretching across the globe. But this ascent came with contradictions. America claimed to promote democracy while denying rights at home and abroad. African Americans fought bravely overseas while facing racism in their own neighborhoods. The U.S. denounced foreign revolutions, but intervened in the politics of weaker nations. These tensions would only deepen as the world moved towards yet another global conflict in the 1940s.